The Conservatives are keeping up their pressure on Defence Minister Harjit Sajjan. Earlier this week, they called on the Prime Minister to fire Sajjan over the military's sexual misconduct crisis. Well, tonight, the House of Commons will vote on a Conservative motion to censure Sajjan.
How possibly can the women in the Canadian Armed Forces have any faith in this minister to do his job after he failed them so badly for 3 years?
There is clearly a toxic culture in our armed forces, and that must change. And I do want to say our government has full confidence in our Minister of National Defence.
Anita Vandenbeld is the Parliamentary Secretary for the Defence Minister. She is in Ottawa. James Bazan in Selkirk, Manitoba is the Opposition Defence Critic. And Lindsay Matheson, an Ontario NDP MP, joining us from Ottawa. We're going to get to the motion to censure Harjit Sajjan in just a moment, but I want to start with another thing that's just happened over the course of the afternoon, a Conservative move, this one stemming from attempts to get access to documents in the case of the two scientists who were fired from Canada's highest security lab in Winnipeg. And Mr. Bazan, Erin O'Toole announced that Conservatives will pull out of the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians, really intended to be oversight on the national security instruments of this country. Why is your party making this move?
Well, it's pretty simple. There's been 4 attempts now by opposition members of all parties to get the unredacted documents surrounding the two individuals who worked at the National Microbiology Lab in Winnipeg, who have ties back to the Wuhan Virology Lab in China and the Communist Party of China. And the government has refused to provide those documents. And the Speaker actually found a breach of parliamentary privilege because the government hasn't turned these documents over to Parliament itself. Now, the National Security and Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians is not a function of Parliament. It's actually a function of the Prime Minister's office, and the Prime Minister holds the ability to redact and censor any reports that they come forward with. And so that isn't what we're asking for, and so that's why we will not participate going forward on that committee as Conservatives until all documents related to the security breach at the National Virology Lab in Winnipeg is turned over to Parliament itself, unredacted, so that we can see exactly what happened here and giving these people national security clearances.
Okay, so let me just jump in on you here, because this committee, the Prime Minister's office will say, exists so that there is parliamentary oversight in a responsible way of things that are top secret and other national security issues in this country, and that it exists so that top secret information is seen only by a small group of people, that there is parliamentary oversight, but that there is less of a risk that it gets shared widely, which shouldn't happen. By leaving the committee, the 2 new Conservative MPs who were just named a couple of days ago will not be part of any kind of oversight. Is there not a risk that this move politicizes that National Security Committee?
It's politicized by the fact that the Prime Minister, delayed appointing our Conservative members on this committee for the last several months. They were originally nominated back in September of 2020, and now is going to control what information comes out of that committee as it responds to these security breaches at Winnipeg's National Virology Lab. So again, it comes down to it's the Prime Minister who's politicized this. It's the Prime Minister who's withholding information. And it has been parliamentarians from all parties that have requested this information be given to Parliament, not to the National Security Intelligence Committee of Parliamentarians. That's controlled by the Prime Minister himself.
Okay, so Ms. Vandenbeld, obviously an opportunity for you to respond here, but I also wonder if does this kill that committee? What happens with no Conservatives on it?
Well, first of all, I think boycotting a committee is never the right thing to do. This was a committee that was established specifically so that parliamentarians could be sworn into the Privy Council, so that they could see these top secret documents and be able to provide that oversight. And, this is frankly quite typical that the Conservatives, rather than engaging, rather than working in good faith to try to find answers, they are just walking away and just throwing up their hands and taking their marbles and going home. And frankly, it's sad because this committee has done tremendous work. And even Leona Aleslav, Ms. Aleslav yesterday, tweeted that she was honored to be part of this committee. So I think it's a political stunt, and I think that it actually does damage to the institution and to the ability to be able to have oversight of our national security institutions.
Okay, so we have a limited amount of time with you, and I want to talk about this motion which will be voted on tonight to censure Harjit Sajjan, the Defence Minister. It's a motion that's been brought forward by the Conservatives. The NDP have indicated that they will support it, so Lindsay Matheson, certainly want to get your thoughts on it. But very quickly, let me start with you, James Bazan. This is something that doesn't actually have consequence within Parliament. Why do it?
It actually does have consequence in Parliament because it is the House expressing itself about members of Parliament. The minister is a member of Parliament, and if he is censored by the House, he's not going to be able to speak within the House. And so, again, it reflects the disappointment of all parliamentarians who vote in favor of this motion, which would be Conservative Bloc, NDP, and some independents, that are going to show that Minister Sajjan has had a very casual relationship with the truth, that he has been misleading Parliament and misleading Canadians on the most egregious things revolve around the sexual misconduct allegations that he sat on for 3 years on Jonathan Vance. He had 3 years he could have righted the ship, 3 years that he could have worked to change the culture and stomp out sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces, but instead he turned a blind eye and pushed away the evidence. So it's time to be accountable, and since Minister Sajjan won't do the honourable thing and resign, and since Prime Minister Trudeau won't do the right thing and fire him, well, as parliamentarians, we only have one option left, and that is to censure him and prevent him from speaking in the House and at parliamentary committees going forward. So,
Ms. Matheson, the NDP have said that they're going to support this motion, and they're going to do so because they believe there's been a lack of leadership from the minister. I do wonder, aside from the sort of non-binding motion, what else can MPs do to support members of the military? And I ask, in the context of multiple generals having either come under investigation or resigned or have had to apologize, what are the things that MPs can do to support members of the military, survivors of sexual misconduct and sexual assault, and others?
So Mr. Bazan is absolutely correct, and it has been very frustrating to get any advancement on this file, anything out of the Prime Minister, out of the Minister, and he has had 6 years. What other parliamentarians, what we can do are things that we've been doing already. We've been trying to put as much pressure as we can. I'm a member of the Status of Women Committee, and we've put forward, actually it was just tabled today, an excellent report. There are 21 recommendations within that report that I know that we will continue, and members of that committee will continue to put pressure on the government for. And we just can't let that, pressure go. I know that I am so dedicated, and I've heard so many horrific stories, and people have come to me with their hearts in their hands saying, you have to please help us. And so it is our responsibility. It's supposed to be the minister's responsibility, but it is absolutely our responsibility to ensure that they get that help. And the government should have been doing this for the last 6 years at the very least, but this toxic culture cannot continue, and it is our responsibility to hold them to that.
Ms. Van den Belt, I want to ask you, we spoke with a former Vice Chief of Defence Staff, retired Lieutenant General Guy Thibault, on the program yesterday, and he said this is a very dark period for the Canadian Forces, and it is having an impact on operations, it is having an impact on the ranks. Is that entirely at the fault of senior leaders of the Canadian Armed Forces, or does the government owe something to the soldiers of the Canadian Armed Forces for its role?
Well, first of all, I think what we're seeing today is that the opposition is making this about politics and not about the survivors, not about the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces. If they did want to do anything for the women and men of the Canadian Armed Forces and survivors, they would pass the budget, which has $236 million for things like peer-to-peer support and the sexual misconduct response centers. And in terms of what you have mentioned, one of the things that we're seeing now for the first time is that people are coming forward because they are starting to see consequences. We have seen people lose their jobs. We have seen people under investigation. And this is something that I expect we are going to see more of. It's a very difficult period for the Canadian Armed Forces, but as people feel comfortable coming forward, as we make the institutions more responsive, which is something that the minister is absolutely committed to, and in fact, this is a minister who has spent his entire career, even when as a veteran, when he was in the Canadian Armed Forces, fighting the Old Boys Club. He was the first Canadian Sikh to command a regiment. He has been breaking down barriers and working toward inclusion, both when he served, but also as a minister. And I think that the important thing here, what I would hope, is that parties will come together to look at those recommendations. And I'm glad that the Status of Women Committee did come out with recommendations, because we need to be focused on the survivors and on preventing this from happening in the first place. That's exactly what the minister has been focused on. And you can see that the result is that people are feeling comfortable to come forward on things that in some cases are decades old. But now is the time that that's happening.
Okay, we're going to need to leave the discussion there. Ms. Van den Belde, Mr. Bazan, Ms. Matheson, thank you very much for your time this evening. We will watch for the censure motion and the results of it later this evening. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Vashi Capellos, host of Power in Politics. See more of our show by subscribing to the CBC News channel or click the link for another video.